Alright, I'm kind of pressed for time right here, so I'm going to go through this as clearly and concise as I can. I have something I have to do in a second. This right here is going to be my palette collection for my Cloud Strife for my Mugen game. This right here is my default palette. It's really not my default palette. It's slightly modified. It's more saturated than the default palette that I upload for Fighter Factory. This is basically my starting colors. Next up is the cell palette. That's what I label the act file. It's basically a cell shaded variation of the character. Kills a lot of the gradients in it. Of course, it's sporting a pink materia in the weapon. For those of you who aren't familiar, I believe it's an HP or MP materia. And yes, the materia affects the character during gameplay. Next up, of course, is my Kingdom Hearts palette. My Kingdom Hearts palette is very saturated, super bright, slightly more bluish, brighter browns. He's sporting a yellow materia. Again, the materia affects the character in gameplay. Yellow materia, I believe, speeds the character up or makes him do more attacks than normal. Next up is my Advent Children palette. The materia is actually the same color as Mako or Mako. His clothing is blue, opposing to the purple that he normally wears in original Final Fantasy. And everything that's supposed to be brown on his armor is now gray or black. Next up, I call this my emo palette. It's basically just a black and white palette. I made his eyes blood red and colored his materia red, which is I believe the summon materia. So in game, yes, he does summon different summons. Next up, I believe this is my Remnant palette. It's called Remnant because it mimics Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII, or it mimics one of his remnants, which would be Kadaj, Los, or Yasu from Advent Children. The browns are still there, but I colored all of his clothing black, and of course he's sporting very bright green eyes. And you'll notice he's actually carrying the white materia in his weapon, which is pays homage to Eris or Aerith from the games. Next up, this is my red palette. Every character in my game is going to have a red and black palette. Tough guys love red, so yeah, red and black palette for the character. Not really much to say. Green materia, of course, that's the actually the default materia that you start with in Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I believe is lightning. I think it's a lightning materia, but green materia can signify various different magics, ranging from lightning to fire to ice to other things, etc. Next up, this is actually my default palette. I slightly modified some of the things on it for purposes that I don't wish to divulge. I'm currently playing around with the coding for this character here, and I require this palette to get the whip complete. Next up is my Remake palette. This is the exact color scheme that Cloud wears in Final Fantasy VII Remake, or the remake of the original Final Fantasy VII. So he's sporting his purple clothes. His skin is slightly more pale. He has his traditional blue eyes, and of course his starting green materia. Very beautiful palette. Looks really good in game. Next up is my money palette. Every character in my game has a money palette. Guts has a money palette. My Afro Samurai has a money palette. Even my Taki, I believe, has a money palette. It's just I need a money palette, and I don't know. It just looks good. Oh yeah, he's also sporting the blue materia. I for the life of me can't remember what the blue materia is. I believe it's ad cut. If it's not an elemental, I think it's the ad cut materia, which just means excessive attacks. Next up is another variation of the cell shading palette. It's a lot more flat. This is a work in progress, so I'm not really going to go into detail about it. So just move forward. Next is the silhouette or the pitch black palette. This is the palette I use when I want to make a video and I'm not wanting to divulge my spriting at the moment. Very useful palette. It's good for when I'm doing my whip videos. Next up is the manga palette or the sketch palette. This is what he would look like in an uncolored manga. It's basically just him sketched out and it's full black and white. It looks really cool. in game when you're facing another character that is sporting the same palette. Next up is the Honeybee Inn palette. This mimics the color scheme of the characters from the Honeybee Inn. They even in the 1997 or the original game, the yellow and black was their color scheme in the Honeybee Inn. And of course, in the remake, the females sport this color scheme. You'll notice he's wearing the purple materia, not only because purple is the complementary color of yellow and it pops more, but the purple materia is also its own, has its own stats and it's its own materia in game. So I chose to utilize it for his weapon. And I think that's it. That's all of my palettes for my Cloud Strife at the moment. I'm pretty sure I made a video like this previously, but it was years ago, and it was before the modifications that I have now to it. You'll notice he's come a long way from what I started with. And yeah, that's the full set. Be safe, wash your hands. You guys try to stay out of trouble. Deuces.